Hi, my name is Lamai and I'm a bar practice course student in the UK. Firstly, I'd like to thank you very much for clicking onto this video, and I really hope that you find it helpful. As you're aware, we are in a pandemic and we are trying to fight the coronavirus. In fact, today alone, according to gov.uk, over 23,000 people tested positive to having the coronavirus. As a result, the government have published and enforced the Coronavirus Act 2020, several coronavirus regulations, and also some coronavirus guidelines. I'm very aware that there is some confusion as to what the differences are between the Coronavirus Act, coronavirus regulations, and also coronavirus guidelines. The purpose of this video is to clarify any uncertainty that you have in regard to this topic. So with that being said, I hope that you find this very helpful, and let's get to it. On the 25th of March 2020, the Coronavirus Act of 2020 officially received royal assent. This means that it officially became the law. This act is an example of primary legislation. Primary legislation are the main laws that are usually passed by Parliament. This act has enabled the government to control or restrict public gatherings, to control or suspend public transport, and to order businesses and restaurants to remain closed. Breaching an act of Parliament creates liability, a liability that is enforceable by the UK courts. For example, if you fail to wear a face mask covering on public transport unless you are exempt, you may receive a fixed penalty of £200. This can reduce to £100 if paid within 14 days. Or the courts may get involved, and this may be punishable on a summary conviction, and you may receive a fine not exceeding £5,000. So just to clarify, an Act of Parliament is the law, and it is an example of primary legislation in the UK. So yes, the Coronavirus Act 2020 is very much so the law. Now we can move on to the regulations. Regulations are an example of secondary legislation. For example, the Health Protection, Coronavirus, Restrictions, All Tiers England Regulations of 2020. And yes, that was a mouthful. It is law created by ministers or other bodies under powers given to them by an Act of Parliament. So for example, the Coronavirus Act gives certain powers to certain people in Parliament to create regulations. Regulations are subordinate to acts, and the main purpose of regulations are to help you understand the primary legislation. Regulations are linked to a specific act, and its main purpose is to aid and help you understand the principles of that act so that you can apply it to your life. For example, on the 15th of June 2020, new coronavirus regulations came into effect and made it a criminal offence to use public transport without a face covering, unless you had a reasonable excuse. Another example, on the 18th of September 2020, new coronavirus regulations were enforced, which required certain people and businesses to collect the names and contact details of people who wanted to enter their premises, business or restaurant. I remember this because when I was going into TGI Fridays, I recall having to give my contact details and my name. And yes, this was in fact the law. Now, let's move on to guidelines. I understand that there is a lot of confusion and uncertainty as to what are guidelines, and I'm here to help. Guidelines are basically pieces of advice that the government give. Strictly speaking, a guideline on its own is not law. However, this is where people need to be careful. Guidelines are backed up by the law. Usually you'll find a guideline is supported by the law. A guideline may not explicitly read word for word what an Act of Parliament or regulation says, but most times you'll find guidelines are backed up and supported by an Act of Parliament or a regulation. This is very important to note because there are a lot of people that are confused about the powers that each category possess. Guidelines on their own are not necessarily the law. However, guidelines do have the backing of an Act of Parliament and regulations. The apple doesn't really fall far from the tree, if you see it that way. So, in conclusion, I hope that I have clarified any uncertainties that you have or you may have had before watching this video. There is a Coronavirus Act 2020. There are several regulations that have been put in place, and I will link them below. And there are also guidelines that you can find on gov.uk. So ultimately, before I leave, my advice to you is to read the guidelines, take a look at the Coronavirus Act, read the regulations that are out there, and understand what exactly it says and what responsibility you have in fighting the coronavirus. In conclusion, I'd like to thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you found it helpful. My name is Lamai and I'm a bar practice course student. I have to stress, I'm not a barrister yet. I am an aspiring barrister. Take care and stay safe.